one of our authors, who is a pastor, a seminary professor, who is someone who has written really a book that has impacted lots and lots of churches, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And so we felt with his new book just about to come out, that it would be a good time to talk about both this book that has made such an impact and all of the kind of content involved in that, but really then the impetus for doing the new book, some of the things that have come together around that, what God had put on your heart in terms of even the passion to do that. But as we get started, I thought, Tim, it might be good, just as a starting question, an easy one for you, since some of the guys here probably don't know you at all, if you could just give us a little bit of your background, what would you like folks to know about yourself? Or what should they know?
What they should know is probably classified. I became a believer through the ministry of Campus Crusade while a student at Westchester University. Was called to ministry after graduating from college, went to Westminster Seminary, started a church plant in suburban Philly, which is now Springton Lake Presbyterian Church. They just celebrated, you know how old I must be? They invited me to come back and preach at their 40th anniversary service last fall. And from there I went to Upper Darby, where we were part of revitalizing a church, Crossroads Community Church, urban, multi-ethnic community, and it was a real blessing to be there. We were there 27 years. And when we left, we had first-generation immigrants from 23 countries in our membership, and also we saw that diversity in our staff and among our leadership too. And along the way there, I was also invited to come and become part of the faculty at Westminster Seminary. You know what I like to tell people? I like to tell people that I only go places where they're desperate. So, Westminster at that time, Harvey Kahn was very ill. George Fuller had just retired, so they needed someone to come in and help with PT. And I taught a couple of courses there in previous years. And so they had me come in and join the faculty. So for several years, I was wearing two hats as a pastor and a professor at Westminster Seminary. And retired from my church in Upper Darby. And 2 weeks after retiring from there, ran into my wife's cousin in a grocery store in New Holland, where we had moved. And her cousin was the president of the consistory of a UCC church in New Holland. And they didn't have a pastor. And so she said to me, "You're a preacher, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a preacher." And so she said, "Will you come and help fill our pulpit?" I said, "Okay." So after my first sermon, they invited me to come and meet with the consistory. They wanted me to become their part-time minister. And I said, "What's the part-time minister's job description?" They said, "All the preaching, all the teaching, all the marrying, all the burying, all the visiting." I said, "That's not part-time." They said, "We know." But I challenged them. I said, "Look, you all need to consider principles before particulars. You need to get out of the UCC. Sorry, any UCC ministers here? Well, I don't care. Because it's the same for you. Because they were running out of money, running out of people, and I challenged them to rethink their affiliation with the UCC. And 1 month later, they voted 54-2 to leave the UCC. Then I went back and I said, "Okay, now I'm willing to consider being your part-time pastor if you're willing to consider identifying with the denomination. You can't be just out here floating around, and you need to be identified with a biblically based denomination." And since their roots were in the German Reformed Church, we had a common ancestry, Westminster Standards and the Heidelberg Catechism. So I made that argument. Long story short there is that they voted to call me as a part-time pastor and to come into the PCA. So that happened in 2015, and I was there until 2021. And now I'm unretired again. I am now the part-time interim pastor at RPC in Ephrata. So
I didn't even know that. So wow.
I got to keep up here, Dave. Come on.
You're so busy.
Yeah,
Well, Tim, thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that background. But we're going to be talking today really about the intersection of shepherding, leadership, what it means to be an elder in the church, and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And Tim, you've spent many years thinking and writing about shepherding and church leadership. And I'm just curious, where did the passion and interest in this particular topic come from? What was kind of the spark for you on that?
Well, the spark for me was twofold. First of all, I was reflecting on my own experience in church. I grew up in a church in my hometown, and I went off to college, and it was as if I dropped off the face of the earth. I never heard from anybody. Nobody ever reached out to me. And this is the reason that most of the time when we lose people to the church, it's when they go off to college or do things like that. But then teaching at Westminster, I taught a course called Church Dynamics and Pastoral Practice. And in that course, I would have the students go out and interview pastors. Local pastors love that, don't you, Mark? Send the students out there to interview about different, many of you have been the victims. You've been helpful in that regard. And so this time it was on shepherding. So I sent 25 students out to interview leaders on the shepherding ministries in their churches. And when it came time to report, we probably had 20 reports because there were some students who were in the same church. 20 reports, and among those reports, there were very few churches at that time who had any kind of shepherding ministry. And around that time also, I was getting calls to come in and consult with churches about that. And so that's the motivation for this. I should also say that I did my doctoral work at RTS focusing on this as well.
That's helpful. So The Shepherd Leader was first published in 2010 and was almost an instant success. Why do you think there was such a hunger for this book at that particular time?
I think, by the way, I wanted to thank you for allowing me to be part of the longest commercial I've ever been part of. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's just getting longer.
I think I was as surprised as anybody, but I just think it hit a need in the church at that time. But I think the thing about the Shepherd Leader is that it not only gives the historical and the biblical and theological foundations, but it gives a lot of how-to practical steps for how to actually implement a shepherding ministry in the church. And I think that's the reason that it has really helped out churches.
Yeah. Well,
by the way, I want to say one more thing. I was so grateful. I had to come in late last night. I was so grateful for the local welcome that I received. It was lights and sirens behind my car as I came in. But the policeman was gracious. He did not give me a ticket.
So it wasn't a personal escort to the facility?
I thought it was a personal escort at first, but.
Well, thank you for sharing a little bit of that background. We want to dig a little deeper now into The Shepherd Leader. Not all of you would have even seen or read this book, and so I think it's helpful to kind of unpack it a little bit. So in The Shepherd Leader, you identify what you call a comprehensive matrix for ministry that involves 4 key elements. You list those as knowing the sheep, feeding the sheep, leading the sheep, and protecting the sheep. So why 4? Why these particular 4? And we can delve into any one that you particularly think we need to, but I'm curious about how you came up with that comprehensive matrix. What kind of led you to that?
The matrix, let me just make a comment about, I'll make a comment about the 4 first. Knowing, feeding, leading, and protecting. Just as you study the work of the shepherd, even as you look at the 23rd Psalm, you can see those 4 functions manifested even right there. Having, the Lord is my shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd. The primary dynamic between shepherd and sheep is the shepherd knows the sheep and the sheep know the shepherd. That's the dynamic. So knowing, feeding, leading, and protecting. I think you can all see those four functions. In fact, I was asked, there was another guy writing a book on church planting, and he reached out to me and he said, we really like your four shepherding functions. We'd like your permission to use them. I said, you don't need my permission. It's right in the Bible there, So as I've traveled around, what has been most helpful to people, it seems, is the distinction between macro shepherding and micro shepherding. So macro shepherding is how we care for the flock as a whole. For example, in a category of feeding, the macro category would include the public ministry of the word, teaching, preaching, Sunday school curriculum, those kinds of things, those corporate responsibilities we have as elders. But micro feeding would be the personal ministry of the elders to the sheep, mentoring, discipling, and that distinction of macro and micro, I think, has been very, very helpful to people to kind of sort things out in terms of we're not just a board of directors making decisions on the macro level. We are to be shepherding the flock, as Peter says in 1 Peter 5.
As you think about those four categories, the knowing, the feeding, the leading, and the protecting, are there any of those that you would say, hey, I think the church is doing a pretty good job at that? As I've seen it over the years, this is an area where maybe we've grown or developed. And is there an area that you go, yeah, that's an area we really still need a lot more work in? Or would you just say, hey, all of the above from your perspective in the experience that you've worked with?
One of the things we've done in a recent couple of years is actually take those 8 quadrants, the macro and micro, knowing, feeding, leading, and protecting, and asked the elders of their churches which they think is the strongest category. And most of the time we're dealing with Reformed churches, and so guess which the strongest category is? Macro feeding. That's right. And of course, as pastors are very happy to hear that, But I'd say that the problem comes at the very beginning. It's the relational. So far, almost every church has identified micro-knowing as the main problem. And we've actually developed, and there's reference to this in the Shepherd's Toolbox, we've actually developed a digital self-assessment for elders that will be available. And in that self-assessment, it gives elders an opportunity to note what is the strongest and what is the weakest. But for me, I guess you could call me a consultant now. Am I a consultant now?
Yeah, I think so.
Am I a consultant? Okay. So I go and I consult with elders. But I don't want to offend anybody by saying this, but
go for it.
Sometimes I love kitchen nightmares with Chef Ramsay. He goes into a restaurant and it's a disaster. He has a meal, and then he has their dinner service, and then he goes and talks to the owners, and he tells them exactly what it's like. He says, this food stinks, and they're shocked. And he says, your service stinks, and they're shocked. But after the conflict, they work through it and they actually save the place for the most part. And I would I'd like to be a Chef Ramsay type without the obscenities.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, I like to go into a church and say, there's no wonder people don't come back to your church. Your people are just rude. Or, no wonder young people don't come to your church. Your nursery stinks. Literally, it stinks. But there's one thing that I could bring it all down to find out how effective a shepherding plan is in a given church. If I had permission to randomly choose 5 members to call and ask this simple question: who's your shepherd? Of course, I'll say Jesus, but who's caring, who's overseeing you and the elders or the leaders of the church? Yeah. And it's Folks, this book is not rocket science. It's just not.
Yeah.
And that life on life ministry that we're called to I'd say that's the big challenge.
So just jumping off from that, and I'm just throwing an extra question in here at you. How would you define, when you ask that question, what actually is effective shepherding if a church is doing it well?
Yeah. I like to say shepherd is a noun, but it's also a verb. It's one of those really neat words that's both. I'd say it's personal care. You know, the synonym in 1 Peter chapter 5, for example, is overseeing. Overseeing, being able to see in the sense that you're going to be able to know the people. Effective shepherding requires that we know the people, know their needs, are able to help them, address the needs and the challenges, and attached to that is your desire to see them grow. But I think the relational caring piece is so important.
Yeah. So different churches are set up in different ways in terms of their structure and all those kinds of things. But as you've seen and observed churches that you're working with, who are the people that should be doing the shepherding from your perspective? Mm-hmm. Who should we have to be considered for that role?
Well, the answer is simple for me. The answer is that the elders should be doing it. 1 Peter 5, Peter's the only time he addresses leaders, he addresses elders, and he gives them that imperative to shepherd the flock to the elders. Also in Acts chapter 20, Paul says the same thing to the Ephesian elders. That's the word after all the historical references that he gives to his relationship with them. He gets down to the fact that he needed to care for the sheep. So it's the elders. It's the elders who are primarily responsible. Now sometimes, churches are large. Some churches do not have enough elders to care appropriately for the people. And that's one of the questions I get all the time when I go places. How do we get more elders? How do we get more elders? And the short answer is you need to work with the men of the church. You need to be developing a ministry among the men of the church to disciple them and train them. And of course, one of the dangers is that on occasion, people get thrust into the office. I think this is the case when you have a class system of elders. And the appendix to this book has John Murray's very detailed criticism of classes of elders. But the problem with that is that sometimes elders are advanced too soon. And people have also asked me, well, how many elders should a church have? Because if you got a class system, you've got a set number. You've got 9, 6, 12, whatever, wherever that number comes from. I assume it comes from the Bible somewhere. It must come from the Bible. But how many elders should a church have? Here's the answer. As many men as are called, gifted, and qualified. No more, no less. No more, no less. And people ask me from time to time, well, what would you do differently in your pastoral ministry of 40 plus years? And here's one of the things I would say is that I wish I'd spent more time with the men. I wish I'd spent more time with the men of the church. So it should be the elders, but on occasion, in large churches, when there are not sufficient numbers of elders to make sufficiently frequent contacts, they employ godly lay people to assist them in making contacts and reporting to them. And it has to be very, very clear, though, that the authoritative responsibility for caring for the flock is with the elders. Yeah.
So related to that, it would seem then, if you're folks that are going to be doing the shepherding are elders, that the qualification for an elder, as you sort of just have gotten into, probably needs to involve a component of being able to do shepherding effectively. And so talk a little bit about how that screening process for an elder should involve looking for folks that might actually have either a gifting toward this or can be trained into that, and how do we screen out people that are probably not a fit for that sort of thing?
This is one of the benefits of having an effective, proactive shepherding ministry, because you can see, you get to know your people, and you can see people who love the flock, who have relationships in the flock, and maybe even serving as unofficial leaders. You know, one leader one time said, "If you think you're a leader and no one's following, you're just taking a walk." And so these people rise, and if you're shepherding, you can identify these people and then engage them further in an equipping way.
All right, we're going to dig a little deeper into the shepherd leader now.
Let's go deeper, Dave.
All right.
Come on.
So chapter 9 in your book identifies 7 essential, of course it's 7 because it's a biblical number, essential elements for effective shepherding ministry. And these include, it must be biblical, it must be systematic, it must be comprehensive, it must be relational, it must include the 4 shepherding functions we just talked about, must include accountability, and must include prayer. I'd like to think through maybe each one of those at a certain level, but also, before we do that, just thinking through, is there any one of those that rises to the highest priority? You know, is there any ranking in that in any sense? And if not, that's fine. I'm just curious as to how you saw that as you were thinking about that.
Well, there are 2 that stand out as the greatest weaknesses in churches. One is the comprehensiveness test. So for a shepherding ministry to be comprehensive, it has to include all the members on the roll. So that requires, of course, you have to have an accurate membership roll. So when I went to the church in New Holland that had 60 people in worship, they had 900 people on their roll. Wow. Because, the church went back to 1732. I don't think any of those people were still on the roll, but... But there were a lot of people who were just gone or dead or whatever, so we had to deal with that. So we had to make sure that every member is accounted for. That's a comprehensiveness test. And when I would ask people moving from place to place, actually in research for this book, how do you shepherd your people? The most common answer I got was small groups. They said small groups. And I said, how many members are in small groups? And if they would say 60%, I think many of you would be happy if 60% of your people were in small groups, wouldn't you? Or 70%? Yeah. But what's my next question? What about the others? I actually had a couple leaders say to me, well, if people want to be shepherded, they'll get into a small group. No. That's not how it works. So the comprehensiveness test is one that is very weak or needs to be addressed. But probably the most challenging one is accountability. So once you establish a shepherding ministry, we can get all excited about that, but how do we hold one another accountable to make sure that actually happens? So I think those are the 2 that are the most challenging to churches.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, we'll dig into a couple of these, but I want to ask this question. We might have a church someone represented here today that says, I'm honestly looking at my church and I don't think we have a really effective shepherding program. And I'd like to own that. I'd like to start from somewhere. What are some of the sort of key starting points? If you're going to start almost from scratch, let's just say, or you've got a program but it's just not functional, it's just not working, it doesn't have this, the 7 elements, or there's just key things missing, where would you say you would encourage a pastor to start, looking at the beginning of building what will ultimately be an effective shepherding program?
Well, in these 7 elements, the reason biblical is first because it's the most important. So I think it's important for you and your elders to study these key biblical texts when it comes to shepherding the flock and the responsibilities of elders. Because if we're not convinced that what we're doing is biblical, we shouldn't be doing it. So that's where I would start. When I was first becoming convinced of this myself, I was at Crossroads Church in Upper Darby, and I was 33 years old, and all my elders were in their 60s or 70s, which seems very young to me now. It seemed very old to me then. But nonetheless, we went over this biblical material, and they bought in, so to speak. They believed this. But I had one elder who said to me, he said, "Tim, I just want you to know that I'm not going to make any calls." And what I did was I said, "Okay, Bill, what I'd like you to do is you can sit with me as I pray for my shepherding contacts," and that was fine. And I was hoping the vision would be caught, was never caught. And then he moved away to another county, to a retirement facility, started going to another church. And the first thing he did when he went to the new church was take this book up to the pastor and said, "We need to do this." So I don't know what that was all about. But I think that's where, and you have to be convinced. Now, you have to be convinced, if you're a senior pastor, you need to be convinced that this is something that you need to take more seriously and you need to address. And then you can move into the biblical material, and then you can move into asking the question, okay, if this is indeed something we should be doing, if we should be proactively interacting with our people, what is the best way for us to do that? And then that's going to be different in different settings.
Well, thank you for that little segue, because my next question was going to be about that. I think a lot of times the intimidation factor of this, and maybe some of the horror stories people hear too about how difficult this is, how burnt out people get, they try something, it didn't work, or they put in some huge comprehensive system and now it's just kind of falling apart kind of a thing, may lead some to go, whoa, wait a minute, before I jump into this and do this, I want to kind of count the cost a little bit. Mm-hmm. But you were inferring there that maybe it's not a one-size-fits all, that there can be different ways to approach this. If I heard you correctly, this proactive knowing of your people is sort of the priority. Mm-hmm. But talk a little bit about how does that look in sort of the small, medium, and large church contexts. How have you seen people doing it that still fit under the rubric of effective shepherding, but may look different?
Mm-hmm. Proactive contact is the key. Regular contact, depending on the circumstances. At our church at Crossroads, our goal was to reach out to every member every month. Yeah. But when we moved out to New Holland, we did not have sufficient elders because we were just moving into the PCA. We had to revise that plan to be every 60 days. Okay. Every 60 days. But it has to be something, one of the 7 elements, it has to be systematic. There has to be a plan, but it has to be realistic. It has to be something that elders are willing and able to do. But, one of the contributors, I'm going to skip ahead just a moment.
I'll go for it. Yeah. Sneak peek. So the Shepherd's Toolbox basically addresses some of these challenges that we've seen since the Shepherd Leader was published. The comprehensiveness especially, but we have a contributor, his name is Randy Schlichting. He is the shepherding pastor at Perimeter Church in Atlanta. They have 4,500 members.
But they have 300 elders. They have 300 elders. But you say, well, how would you manage that kind of a session meeting, huh? Can you imagine that? Take the roll and you're done. But they committed themselves to shepherd that large flock. And what they do, among the elders, they have an administrative team of, say, 12 to 15, I think, who do the monthly business type stuff, but everybody else is a shepherd. And so each of those elders only has 4 to 7 families that they contact on a regular basis. And, I think that speaks to the fact, J.I. Packer writes in his introduction to the Reformed Pastor, he said, if this is something that we believe we should do, we're not going to do it the way Baxter did it, but where there's a will, there's a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. And so that church in Atlanta has proven that to me, and that it's a very, very important part of their ministry. So you have to be flexible. Some people believe that it has to be visitation. I'm not against visitation, but I do not believe that in most churches visitation occurs with sufficient frequency to establish the kind of credible relationship that we need to be shepherds. That's one of the reasons that my viewpoint now is it's whatever it takes to make that regular connection with the people, as long as they know that it's a shepherding contact. For me, a phone call is good, but do you know how many college students answer their phone? Did you ever try? Do you know how many college students respond to email? So we were talking about this with a group of elders one time, and I was saying, whatever it takes, if you've got to text college students, text them. So I see this elder in the front row going like this, and he puts his hand up. I said, what? He said, I just texted one of my college students, and he answered me right away. So it has to be a sufficiently frequent contact to establish a credible relationship, I think.
Okay. All right, so here's a tough one. So we've done it. We've started it. Someone's engaging their folks, are being proactive. But then the scary thing happens. They start actually getting to know their people, okay? And their people start telling them some of their problems. And we start identifying there's a lot more going on in this congregation than we knew about. So how does the effective shepherding plan work? Because obviously, on one hand, we're talking about let's identify these things, let's get to know our people, but what happens when we get to know them and these things are identified? How does that work itself out in an effective shepherding program?
A couple of years ago, someone asked me, after I retired for the second time, they asked me, what has been the most blessed part of pastoral ministry? And I said, the people. Then they said, well, what's the most challenging part? And I said, the people. Praise God that we get to know their needs. So many of them are suffering in silence, But I think this is one of the reasons why we need to continue to work together as a band of brothers. Also, we're supposed to be equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. And so you're not alone when you're in this. So pulling people into the process when there is a specific need that needs to be addressed that may require more than simply the elders' input. In our church in New Holland, we established when there was a big issue that would come up, we would establish a care team that would include an elder and a deacon and some lay people to come alongside a family to help walk through a thing. Now, that's going to be many times temporary. But it goes to the whatever it takes part of ministry. The other side of that, since we're talking about proactive shepherding, we should be talking about proactive training too.
Oh, that's good.
So when you're working with your elders, talk about some things occasionally, study some things occasionally that's going to equip your elders in the event that they reach this particular challenge or problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you thought we were here to talk about your new book. We'll finally get to that now. How's that? All right. Here we go. So.
Oh, the advertisement begins now,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
The commercial begins now.
And John, I don't know if you have an ability to put that slide up. I had sent an image of the cover of the book. If we can do that now, that would be great. If not, don't worry about it. We'll have it eventually. But here's the question. So your new book, which is called The Shepherd's Toolbox, very clever title, I think. Tell us a little bit about the project in general, and what motivated you to do the new book.
When the 10th anniversary of the Shepherd Leader was coming up, would have been 2020, we entertained the possibility of doing a revised edition of this, as others have done with other books. But I thought that I wanted to do something different, something that would bring into view some of the really effective ways that leaders had applied the shepherding principles from this book. And so I reached out to, and P&R was graciously willing to walk out on the plank with me for that one. And I had gotten to know these contributors who had done such great work in their particular areas, and asked them if they would contribute a chapter to the Shepherd's Toolbox. And so that's what we have. I have the opening chapter and the closing chapter, and the others are contributing in between. And these authors are addressing some of the things that are really key needs in shepherding ministries.
Yeah. So what was it like being, in a sense, kind of the editor for a book like this and working with a multi-author project for you? How was that?
It's like herding cats. You know, I thought to myself, do you see the similarity in a cover, by the way? Just
total accident.
Yeah, total accident. It was a challenge because different authors have different writing styles. It was harder work than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, I sent the final manuscript into P&R. And it wasn't the final manuscript. Yeah. So it was a lot of work, but it was. I think you'll find it to be very fruitful.
Yeah, we sure hope so. All right. So again, without giving away all of the secrets of the new book, because we do want people to read it. Okay. What are some of the key lessons that churches have learned from implementing the Shepherd Leader? What were some of the things that were takeaways that you were like, oh, yeah, no, that worked, or no, maybe that didn't work so well, but things that as you talk to these leaders back and forth and maybe even contributed to why certain chapters were in the book and things like that. So
yeah. I think one of the most important chapters in the book is written by Sue Harris from Oak Mountain Presbyterian Church. Because a question that kept coming to me through the years has been, what about the women? Who's taking care of the women? And Sue is leading a ministry at that church in which they're reaching out to godly, gifted women to come alongside elders to reach out to the women of the church. And it's a redundancy. It's not as if these women are taking over the responsibility of elders. No, they're coming alongside women, say wives, in a family that has also an elder. But if there's something that the women are more comfortable speaking to a woman about, they have godly women working alongside. And I think that there are people who have already been reaching out to her to see how do we do this so that we can better care for our women. I think another chapter is by John Barrett, who's the executive pastor at First Presbyterian in Augusta. Over the last 6 months, I've returned to churches to consult about shepherding that I first consulted with 20 years ago. And they've had me back, and some of them have had me back several times. But you know what I love about that is that they don't give up. Amen. They don't give up. And John Barrett, the thing I like about his chapter is that he walks through the challenges they face. So it includes shepherding 1.0, shepherding 2.0. But the key to that chapter is not to give up. And you can see examples of how that happens. Another area that is very dear to my heart is one of the questions that's come up over the years. So where does evangelism fit into this? Where does evangelism fit into this? And PCA, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. I hope there's going to be cake. But one of the things the PCA started, one of the things that attracted me about the PCA was its emphasis on evangelism. But I remember the very first General Assembly I attended. It was at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale, and we were debating joining and receiving. Should we join together with the OPC and the RPCES? And there was a very well-known radio broadcaster from the South who stood up and he said, well, fathers and brethren, I don't know if we should be hitching our wagon to these brothers because they don't have enough evangelistic zeal. D. James Kennedy stands up in Coral Ridge, which evangelism built, and he said, fathers and brethren, I don't think we should be patting ourselves on our backs for our evangelistic zeal. And he sat down. I said, man, that was awesome. And I think that's something that we still need to focus on. So people ask me that. I say, well, you know, you could look at the macro leadership quadrant and say that's one of the things we should be leading in. We should be leading in evangelism. But where it really begins is, you know, most of this is about caring for the sheep. Archibald Alexander, when he was addressing some Princeton graduates, of course, many years ago, he said there are three classes of sheep. He said there are sheep who have already gone on to glory. He said there are sheep who are in the fold now. And he said there are sheep who have not yet heard or responded to the Good Shepherd's call. And so I wrote a chapter in the book about, you know, kind of challenging us to extend that call of the Good Shepherd so that his elect will hear and respond, and so then they will come into the flock where they can be cared for. So that's one of my contributions to the book. Also in that section of the book, Mark Halleck, who is a church planter in Colorado, he's a Southern Baptist. He got his, not that there's anything wrong with that.
We actually allowed a Baptist into the book?
We like Baptists,
okay.
Yeah. And so Mark is awesome. He did his D-Min at Westminster. And he has established a family of churches. They call themselves the Calvary. Thank you. Calvary family of churches that's planted or revitalized 30 churches out there. And at the heart of it is, well, you need to be involved in shepherding the flock from the very beginning. It needs to be a part if your church is going to be healthy, if your church is going to grow, if your church is going to multiply. So he wrote a chapter about that, which I think is going to be very helpful too.
So I want to unpack, you know, the difficult side of this in some cases.
I thought we'd already started that.
We're sort of there. But,
yeah,
you know,
okay.
We'll go a little further here. And you wrote a chapter, which I particularly appreciated as I was reading the manuscript, on motivation for shepherding. And I'd like you to talk about that. And I want to come back and circle back to, are there certain key things that you have noticed that are real stumbling blocks for folks who've tried it and maybe just aren't keeping going with it, what they stumble over? But I want to particularly start with the motivation issue, because I think that was part of your passion for writing that chapter, was the keeping going as you just talked about it, and why that's so critical to an effective shepherding process in the church.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that shepherd is a noun and shepherd is a verb. And a lot of the book has to do with the action part, but the first chapter that I wrote, the motivation for shepherding, has to do with the fact that what is a shepherd and having the proper motivation to care for the flock. The chapter is entitled Read This First, the motivation for shepherding. And it talks about the fact that whenever you order stuff from IKEA, and it comes with the directions, right? Do you follow the directions? Do you or don't you? It says, read this first. Do you read this first? Well, even when I read this first, I can't get it together right. Ask my wife, she would tell you that. But read this first is the motivation, and I think Jesus put that to Peter in John chapter 21, where he says, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Very familiar passage. And then he says, take care of my sheep, feed my flock. All three responses to Peter have to do with taking care of the flock. But the motivation, do you love me? Do you love me? And that's something I have to ask myself. Is that my motivation for ministry? My love for the Savior? And of course, that's grounded in my knowledge of his love for me, that he is my shepherd. I'm not here by myself. He's called me to this, and therefore he's going to give me what I need to carry this out. And in that occurrence in John chapter 21, I think there are things, as you guys know, which would have reminded Peter of his initial call to the gospel. He was fishing when Jesus called him to follow him. And there it was again. So I can't help but think that Peter was reflecting way back to those early days. And so that chapter, we have in each chapter we have basically a kind of a practical application at the end for people to think about what to do with this. And what I suggest in that chapter is for people just to take a personal retreat and reflect on when God first called you to be his follower, to be his sheep. And then to reflect again on when God called you to shepherd his flock. And those things can be very, very encouraging, but also to reflect on whether our ministry is flowing out of love for our Savior. Love for the people too. Love for the people too. The people are hard to love sometimes, but we're called to love the people too. So, that's where the book starts. Yeah.
One of the things I've heard as an elder, as a reason that some guys pull back from this responsibility, is just the overwhelming nature of the time commitment, all the things that go on. And I remember hearing a brother who was an elder, and we were in a group of maybe 8 to 10 elders, comment that he himself did not feel shepherded. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting question or comment. And we're here to talk about shepherding the shepherds. That's part of what this conference is about. Any thoughts about how elders who can become overwhelmed, who can be, doing all this good work and then feeling like maybe they themselves are not actually getting the kind of shepherding that they need, how do the elder teams, maybe working with their pastors and the pastoral team, make sure that that's also happening and it's not just the folks in their church that are being shepherded?
Yeah. That's a great question. And different churches do that differently, but I think the key is that it has to be something that is thought out and understood. So that at our church in Upper Darby, the elders were my flock. So they each had a flock, but the elders were my flock, and so I would call them. But what I discovered was that it was then that I was getting shepherded back. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I have a funeral for a very godly elder in that church. And I remember when I would call him to shepherd him. At that time, our daughter was going through some really rough times when she was living in Georgia. And he would always ask about her. because he knew that was heavy on my heart. And he said to me, he said, my wife and I pray for her every day. I'll tell you what, that really, still to this day, touches me. So they understood that I was going to be reaching out to them, but they also understood that there was a mutually agreeable two-way street with the pastor. So I think whatever you do, you need to think, well, this is how we're going to be caring for our elders, for our leadership team. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to give you one last one, and then what we're going to do is we're going to switch it up just a little bit here. I'm going to let you have this microphone. I'm going to take that one.
Okay.
And we're going to give you as the audience an opportunity to kind of engage here just a little bit. We'll take about 10 minutes for some Q&A from you guys. Hopefully this has stimulated some thoughts on some questions. I'm guessing that each of your churches has unique shepherding challenges and unique issues within that context. And so we want to give you a chance to do that. But so I'm an elder in a PCA church, and I come to you and I say, Tim, we are really struggling, with this issue. And I'm kind of digging back into that point I made earlier. If there was one chapter that you would suggest from the new book in particular that I really pay attention to, is there any particular area you would say, hey, spend time here before you go off and this tangent and work on technology or women's roles or those kinds of things? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it would be the one you referred to earlier, the motivation.
Gotcha.
I think that's where it has to start, because we've all just done ministry and sometimes forgotten the reason why.
Yeah.
So I think you start there.
Yeah.
But I think for any church that's struggling on a new iteration of shepherding, which most churches are, I think Barrett's chapter on persevering is going to be helpful.
And persevering endurance.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right. Before I do this, let's just give a round of applause for this. This is wonderful. Thank you.
All right.
All right. And we'll look for a few brave souls here that will be willing to raise your hand and ask a question. We want to be able to allow folks. Wow. Last night we had hardly anybody, just kidding.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I think I saw you over here first, and we'll come back over here.
Tim, what do you think about cross-training, of having elders and deacons? What intersection of training should there be for both?
That's a great question, Carol. If you've read the first book, you know that I think that deacons and elders can work well together on shepherding teams. In fact, one of my favorite quotes of me, I don't have many, but I have one, and this one is, the offices of elder and deacon together represent the comprehensive care that Christ has provided for his church. Elders and deacons together. So working on shepherding teams together, deacons come alongside elders to help address, to be aware, and then to address physical needs that might arise. And so I think a lot of the training that elders and deacons do, a lot of it should be together, especially when you're talking about caring for the flock. One of my very famous, I guess this is a quote of me too. A favorite summary of an elder's work is this: it's about the sheep, stupid. And I think the same thing can be said about deacons. It's about the sheep, stupid. Unfortunately, in many of our churches, deacons are just seen as glorified janitors, aren't they? But having elders and deacons together really helps them fulfill what their godly role is, to care for the physical needs of the people, not just. And one of the things I'm going to develop is, I was thinking about this morning, is a comprehensive matrix for the deacons, for the work of the deacons, because it's similar. There's macro functions, but there's micro functions too for the office of deacon.
Look, is that a third book coming? I don't know, just kidding. All right.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question. I saw several hands over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, referencing back to, you mentioned there's no Bible number of how many elders, but as many as called and qualified and such. And I spent 15 years at a church, and I spent, then I did my internship there, and you know, education for the pastor is a priority, of course. We all believe in that. And so, but then it turns into like everyone needs to have a D-min. But being on that session one time, I remember one of the pastors, you know, just really applauding the session for being a small session, talking about the problems of big sessions and naming other churches with larger sessions. And so now, you know, we're here, and I saw a friend who's an elder at that church, and he's talking about, he said, we need more pastors. We need more pastors here. And you know, there may be a membership of 1,000, attendance of 2,000, but I just hear that it's like, well, there are, you know, 5 TEs that are there, and the elders are 12, but you know, 5 of them are 5 of them are TEs. So how, you know, there is no, I'm not asking for a ratio is numbers, but a principal ratio, something to how would you just address everything I just said?
Well, let's close with prayer. That's how I address that one. I'd say it's going to be different for every church, but the ideal ratio, I think, is maybe 10 to 12 families per leader. And sometimes you have to go more than that just because of the resources that are available. But everybody has to be, as part of their orientation, they have to be oriented toward the functions of shepherding, I think. Want to follow up?
Yeah, there is an ethos that's there for sure about just, there's an ethos there about just keeping that session small and getting more.
Keeping the session small.
Yeah, that's celebrated because there's too many problems with larger sessions, and so therefore then you just stack the staff with more pastors.
Well, let's see. Do you think that this guy's had a problem with elders before? What do you think? I'd like to know his history a little bit. No. As many as are called, gifted, and qualified. Okay, so right now I am interim pastor of a church. Church attendance is 165. Membership is probably a little over 200. They have 10 elders. And they're good men. They have 10 deacons, and they're good men. And I actually, just 2 weeks ago, I wrote to the pastor who retired, and I said, Tom, I just want to thank you for the fact that you left this church with such an array of godly men to lead this church. So we should always be on the alert for those who are called, gifted, and qualified. And there's nothing meritorious about being a big session. There's nothing meritorious about being a small session. What's meritorious, and only by God's grace, is that those who are called, gifted, and qualified are serving Christ by serving his flock.
Wow, thank you for that. All right, another hand here.
So our ministry context is, I would say, flipped of what you just described. So we have a significant fringe. We have a lot that attend the church and have been part of it for a significant portion of time, and then the actual membership will be much smaller. So the conundrum that we have is, if we just extended shepherding care to those who are members, we would be missing a very significant piece, and yet those people, when push comes to shove, we're not sure whether they would submit to pastoral or elder leadership anyway, because there's a commitment issue. Where and how do you draw those lines?
That's a tough line to draw, but if people are committed, regular attendees over time, what I've done is I've interacted with them and asked them if they would like to be part of the regular caring of the elders. And what we've discovered is that draws them into membership. Now, when push comes to shove, our primary responsibility is to members. But I think it's important to extend that care with the expectation and hope that they might actually become members of the flock.
I see another hand. Here you go, Bill.
How do you pick the teams? What I mean by that is, when you're looking at the congregation, do you have the folks that an elder has a relationship with be the ones that they oversee? Do you just, like a baseball team, you just kind of, everybody lines up and...
You don't want to be the last one standing, right, when you're picking teams. That's a great question. And different churches have done it different ways. So that some churches do it by geography. Some churches do it. I was out in Michigan, the CRC church I ministered in, they do it. One elder took the A's to the G's. The next took the G, you know what I'm saying? But I believe in the elder draft, meaning that though our shepherding ministries may not well be limited to our small groups, if you're doing a draft of the membership, you get your membership roll in order, then you sit as elders and you work through the directory, and you're going to find it's not as difficult as you think, because you're going to say, oh, yeah, they're in my small group, so I'll take them. And then, oh, their kids are the same age as my kids, and I see them all the time. It just goes so quickly and there are very few people who are unaccounted for after those several rounds, and so it's quite practical. So I think it has to be an affinity. It's better if there's an affinity thing, but let me just make one suggestion. If your session is planning to have an elder draft, be sure to be there that night. Because all of our churches have those people. So,
Yeah. Is this kind of like the NFL draft thing? Is there an electronic version of this?
yeah.
Okay, just because that can be fun.
And with his second pick, Elder so-and-so chooses the Smith family.
There we go. I love it.
But it's great, because sometimes, and even then, sometimes it doesn't work out, and you might have to do a trade.
There we go.
I'll trade
I'm
you
feeling
this
a whole
member
new book
for
coming
a
on here.
first-round selection in the next new member class. Sure, I mean, it's a wonderful thing to think about.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Which does somewhat require you to actually know something about your people to be able to do that kind of drafting.
Yes.
So that's kind of important. All right.
Absolutely.
All right, we've got time for one or two more questions. I see a hand almost going up over behind you. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, and also going along with Pastor Bill's, is there a length of time do you feel it's beneficial to stick with that? Well, you can do back and forth and do some trading, but to stay with that initial list for a long period of time, or shake it up after 3 months? And then the second part is, do you feel it's beneficial to maybe post that on the bulletin board in the back of the church, that everybody knows what's going on and everybody gets on board and you don't get surprise calls? And thirdly, do you think it's beneficial maybe if an elder's wife would like to be part of that? As we mentioned, a chapter on the women. I feel sometimes the women feel neglected. These guys show up at the house and they may like to talk to a lady. So there you go.
Not that he's being specific or anything.
Okay. So the first thing, I think one of my problems with the class system is that it affects the continuity in shepherding. So I think that the goal here is to establish a relational credibility with people, so that when I asked people, when are you most likely to hear from your elders? 2 answers. 1, if there's trouble. 2, if they need money. But the point is, if you're establishing a relational, regular contact with people, you're going to have a line of communication where you can bring those things to them, and it's not out of the blue, but you come with some relational credibility and say, oh, by the way, you may have heard that we're having a fundraiser for the new pastor's suite, and hope you've gotten your pledge card so that you can make your large contribution to my comfort. And so continuity is very good. In fact, some churches have now, which I applaud, even where they continue to have a class system, when elders roll off active status, they still maintain their shepherding relationships and their contacts as inactive elders. What was the second part?
Is it good to maybe post, like having the back of the church, everybody's who's assigned to the elder, that they feel like they're going to get called and they're going to expect it and that type of thing?
I think obviously people should know who their elder is, and they should know what form of communication to expect. But whether it's posted or not, I think that's up to each church to decide. And what was the third part? See, my middle-aged brain. I'm giving myself great credit here.
If an elder's wife would like to be part of that, to go be part of that it could be spoken to the women a little bit better. I think, as you mentioned, there's a chapter on
Yeah.
they feel a bit neglected, and sometimes it might be a more.
Yeah, that famous chapter, 1 Timothy 3, where it talks about the qualifications for elder and deacon. That controversial word, deaconess, sometimes it's translated. Calvin thought that meant elders' wives. Elders' wives. And so I think they can be a great asset in coming alongside and caring for the women in the church too.